He stood 5'4". But when he spoke, governors listened, judges obeyed, and entire states fell in line. They called him the Little Man, but there was nothing little about his empire. February 6, 1910. Tunis, Tunisia. A city on the Mediterranean coast, where cultures collided and survival meant adaptation. Calogero Minacor was born into poverty, the son of Sicilian immigrants who had fled to North Africa seeking a better life but found only more struggle. His parents, Giuseppe and Luigia, worked brutal hours for nothing wages, watching their children grow up hungry in a foreign land. In 1911, when Calogero was just an infant, the family made another desperate move. They boarded a ship bound for America, for New Orleans, Louisiana, where they believed opportunity waited. They arrived in the French Quarter, settling into the Italian neighborhoods where Sicilian dialects mixed with Creole French, where the air smelled like seafood and spices, where the streets hummed with music and menace. The family Americanized their name from Minacor to Marcello, and young Calogero became Carlos, later shortened to Carlos, though the government would know him as Carlos. New Orleans in the 1910s and 20s was already a mob city. The Black Hand, prohibition bootleggers, gambling operations, organized crime was woven into the city's fabric like jazz and voodoo. Young Carlos grew up watching how power really worked in New Orleans, how money flowed through illegal channels, how the men with guns and connections lived better than the men breaking their backs for honest wages. Carlos dropped out of school in 4th grade. He couldn't read well, couldn't write much, but he was smart. Street smart, survival smart, cunning. By his teens he was stealing, robbing, working for local criminals. He was arrested multiple times as a juvenile, started building a criminal record that would follow him his entire life. But Carlos wasn't just another thug. He was learning, observing, building relationships. He understood that the real money wasn't in petty crime, it was in organization, in controlling rackets, in being the man who collected from everyone else. He was small in stature, barely 5'4", maybe 170 pounds, but he made up for size with intelligence, ruthlessness, and an instinct for power that would make him one of the most feared mobsters in American history. In the 1930s, Carlos Marcello worked his way up through New Orleans' criminal underworld. He started as muscle, collecting debts, intimidating victims, doing the dirty work that made other criminals money. But Carlos was also building his own operations, running gambling games, loan sharking, stealing. In 1938, at age 28, Carlos committed the crime that defined his early reputation. He was arrested for assault and robbery. He had attacked a man with a hammer over a debt. The victim was hospitalized. Carlos was charged with assault with intent to murder. It was brutal, savage, personal violence, the kind that made people understand you didn't cross Carlos Marcello. He was convicted and sentenced to 9 to 14 years in prison. For most criminals, this would have been a career-ending event. But Carlos served only a few years before being paroled, released early for reasons that remain murky, possibly through political connections, possibly through bribes, possibly through intimidation of witnesses. When Carlos emerged from prison in the early 1940s, he was different. More careful, more strategic, more aware of how to avoid serious legal consequences. He wouldn't stop being violent. Violence was a tool he used his entire life, but he would be smarter about it, more insulated from direct criminal activity. The time in prison had also given him connections to other criminals, to corrupt guards, to lawyers who understood how the system could be manipulated. Carlos had gone into prison as a street thug and emerged as an organized criminal with ambitions beyond New Orleans. In the 1940s, the boss of New Orleans was Sam Silver Dollar Carralla, an old-school Sicilian who controlled gambling, prostitution, and other rackets across Louisiana. Carlos Marcello worked under Carralla, proving himself valuable, earning trust, building power. In 1947, Carralla was deported to Italy, caught up in federal efforts to remove criminal aliens from the United States. With the boss gone, New Orleans needed new leadership. And Carlos Marcello, at 37 years old, stepped into the vacuum. There was no violent takeover, no war for control. Carlos simply assumed leadership and everyone accepted it. He had the connections, the respect, the ruthlessness. The New York families, who had influence over who could be boss in regional territories, approved. Carlos Marcello became the official boss of the New Orleans crime family. But Carlos didn't just take over New Orleans, he expanded the territory. Under his leadership, the New Orleans family controlled all of Louisiana, significant portions of Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, and even parts of Texas. It wasn't the biggest territory in terms of population, but it was vast, stretching across the deep South. Carlos understood that the South operated differently than the Northeast. Violence was accepted more casually, corruption was more entrenched, law enforcement was easier to buy. He adapted his methods to Southern culture, building an empire that would last for 4 decades. One of Carlos Marcello's most brilliant moves was purchasing thousands of acres of swampland outside New Orleans, a property that became known as Churchill Farms. To most people, it looked like worthless marsh, mosquito-infested land good for nothing. But Carlos saw opportunity. The land was cheap, remote, perfect for hiding things, and people. Churchill Farms became Carlos's private kingdom, a place where he conducted business away from surveillance, where bodies could disappear into the swamp, where he could meet with associates without law enforcement watching. Over the years, Carlos transformed parts of Churchill Farms into a legitimate farming operation, growing vegetables and raising livestock. This provided legal income and gave him the appearance of being a legitimate businessman. But the real value was in what the land hid: the meetings, the deals, the secrets buried in the bayou. Churchill Farms also became a symbol of Carlos's power. He owned thousands of acres, controlled a private empire, could retreat to a place where he was completely in charge. Law enforcement knew about Churchill Farms, suspected what happened there but couldn't penetrate it. It was Carlos's fortress, his sanctuary. When federal agents finally raided Churchill Farms decades later, they found evidence of massive criminal activity, but by then the most important secrets had been buried or burned. Carlos had used his swamp kingdom well. Carlos Marcello had a problem. He wasn't technically an American citizen. Born in Tunisia to Italian parents, he had entered the US as an infant but never completed naturalization. This made him vulnerable to deportation, and in the early 1960s, Attorney General Robert Kennedy decided to make Carlos his first major target. Kennedy despised organized crime and saw Carlos as a particularly dangerous mob boss operating with impunity in the South. In April 1961, federal agents literally kidnapped Carlos, seized him without warning, put him on a plane and flew him to Guatemala, dumping him in a country he'd never seen where he knew no one. It was supposed to be the end of Carlos Marcello. He would be stuck in Central America, unable to return, his empire leaderless. But Kennedy underestimated Carlos's resourcefulness and his connections. Carlos immediately began working to get back to the United States. He hired lawyers, bribed officials, called in favors. After several months of legal maneuvering and clandestine travel, Carlos made his way back to Louisiana, sneaking across the border, defying the deportation order, returning to his empire. The deportation battle would continue for years, with federal authorities trying to remove Carlos and Carlos using every legal trick to stay. He would never be successfully deported again. He won the battle against Robert Kennedy, proving that even the Attorney General of the United States couldn't destroy Carlos Marcello. But Carlos never forgot the humiliation of being kidnapped and dumped in Guatemala. And some historians believe that Carlos's hatred for the Kennedy brothers led to the darkest conspiracy theory in American history. President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas on November 22, 1963. Almost immediately, conspiracy theories emerged, and many pointed to organized crime, specifically to Carlos Marcello, as having a role in the assassination. The theory goes like this: Carlos and other mob bosses were enraged by Robert Kennedy's aggressive prosecution of organized crime. The Bay of Pigs failure had ended hopes of reclaiming Cuba. The Kennedy administration was destroying their operations. So they decided to eliminate the president, knowing that with JFK dead, Robert Kennedy would lose power. Carlos had motive: his deportation, the aggressive prosecutions, his hatred for the Kennedys. He had connections in Texas and Louisiana that could facilitate an assassination. He had the ruthlessness to order such a hit. And years later, an FBI informant claimed that Carlos had made statements suggesting he was involved. The House Select Committee on Assassinations in the late 1970s concluded that the Mafia likely had a role in Kennedy's assassination and specifically named Carlos Marcello and Santo Trafficante as probable conspirators. But no definitive proof was ever found. Carlos himself never admitted anything. When questioned, he denied everything, invoked the Fifth Amendment, said nothing that could be used against him. Whether Carlos Marcello was involved in the assassination of President Kennedy remains one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. What is certain is that Carlos despised the Kennedy brothers, had the capability to organize such an operation, and benefited from Robert Kennedy's loss of power after JFK's death. The rest is speculation, conspiracy theory, and unanswered questions. Carlos Marcello's primary moneymaker was gambling, specifically slot machines and illegal casinos across Louisiana and the surrounding states. His organization controlled thousands of slot machines, placed in bars, restaurants, clubs, anywhere people gathered and had cash. The slots were perfect rackets. They generated consistent cash revenue that was difficult for authorities to track. They required minimal labor, just technicians to service the machines and collectors to gather the money. And they were popular. People loved gambling, especially in states where legal casinos didn't exist. Carlos also controlled numerous illegal casinos across his territory, backroom gambling halls, private clubs, operations that ran openly despite being technically illegal. These casinos offered dice games, card games, sports betting, everything a gambler could want. The key to Carlos's gambling empire was corruption. He paid off sheriffs, police chiefs, judges, politicians. Everyone got a piece, enough to ensure they looked the other way, enough to make raiding his operations more trouble than it was worth. This corruption network extended from local police all the way up to state officials. Carlos's gambling operations generated millions of dollars annually, maybe tens of millions over the decades he operated. It was reliable, relatively low risk compared to other rackets, and perfectly suited to the culture of Louisiana, where gambling was part of the social fabric. Like many mob bosses, Carlos Marcello had deep connections to labor unions, particularly the Teamsters. In Louisiana and the Gulf Coast, Carlos controlled or influenced several union locals, giving him power over industries that depended on organized labor. The Teamsters' connection was particularly valuable. The union controlled trucking, warehousing, and transportation, essential industries for commerce. Carlos could threaten strikes, could ensure labor peace, could control who got union contracts. This gave him leverage over legitimate businesses and provided numerous opportunities for extortion and kickbacks. Carlos also had influence in the Longshoremen's Union, which controlled the docks in New Orleans and other Gulf ports. This was crucial for smuggling operations, being able to move goods through ports without inspection or interference. Whether it was stolen merchandise, contraband, or eventually narcotics, Carlos's dock connections made the Gulf Coast a perfect entry point. The labor racketeering also connected Carlos to other mob families. The Teamsters were infiltrated by organized crime nationwide, and Carlos's position in Southern Teamsters leadership made him part of a national network. He worked with Jimmy Hoffa with mob bosses in other cities, coordinating operations and sharing profits. When Robert Kennedy went after the Teamsters and Jimmy Hoffa in the early 1960s, he was also going after Carlos and other mobsters who used the union for criminal purposes. This intensified Carlos's hatred for Kennedy and contributed to the tensions that defined that era. By the 1960s and 70s, Carlos Marcello's organization was deeply involved in narcotics trafficking. The stuff, powder, dope, even pot, was flowing through the Gulf Coast, and Carlos's organization was positioned perfectly to profit from it. Carlos had connections in Central and South America, relationships built during his brief exile in Guatemala. These connections provided access to cocaine sources in Colombia and marijuana sources in Mexico. The drugs came into the United States through Gulf ports that Carlos controlled or influenced, then were distributed across the South and Midwest. The profits from narcotics dwarfed traditional mob rackets. Gambling and loan sharking generated steady money, but narcotics generated fortunes. Carlos became enormously wealthy from drug trafficking, though the exact amounts are impossible to determine. It was all cash, all unreported, all hidden through layers of legitimate businesses. But narcotics also brought increased federal attention. The DA was far more aggressive than the FBI had been about gambling and loan sharking. Drug cases came with mandatory minimum sentences that broke the code of silence. Men facing 20 to 30 years would cooperate, testify, destroy entire organizations. Carlos was careful about his drug operations, operating through intermediaries and maintaining insulation from direct involvement. But the risk was always there, the danger that one weak link would bring down the entire empire. In the late 1970s, the FBI launched an undercover operation called Brilab, short for bribery labor, targeting corruption and mob influence in labor unions and state governments. New Orleans was one of the primary targets, and Carlos Marcello was the ultimate prize. FBI agents posed as corrupt businessmen seeking Carlos's help with insurance contracts and labor problems. They wore wires, recorded conversations, documented bribes and promises. Carlos, confident in his power and perhaps too comfortable after decades of operating with impunity, walked right into the trap. The recordings were devastating. Carlos was caught on tape discussing criminal operations, arranging bribes, exerting influence over state officials. The FBI had finally penetrated his organization, had evidence directly implicating Carlos in serious federal crimes. In 1981, Carlos was indicted on federal racketeering and conspiracy charges stemming from the Brilab investigation. The trial revealed the extent of Carlos's power: his control over state insurance boards, his influence over labor unions, his ability to corrupt government officials. Carlos's lawyers fought hard, using every legal tactic available. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury heard Carlos's own voice discussing crimes, making deals, wielding power. There was no plausible deniability, no way to explain away the recordings. In 1982, Carlos Marcello was convicted and sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. For a man who was 72 years old, it was effectively a life sentence. The little man who had owned the South for 4 decades was finally going down. Carlos's trial wasn't just about one undercover operation. It was a window into decades of corruption in Louisiana. Witnesses testified about payoffs to politicians, about rigged state contracts, about how Carlos had essentially controlled Louisiana politics for years. The evidence showed that Carlos's organization had infiltrated state government at multiple levels: insurance boards, licensing agencies, regulatory commissions. He didn't just bribe officials, he effectively controlled entire agencies, determining who got contracts, who got favorable treatment, who got destroyed. The trial revealed Carlos's net worth, estimated at hundreds of millions of dollars, though much of it was hidden in offshore accounts, real estate, and legitimate businesses. For a man who claimed to be a simple tomato salesman, the numbers were staggering. But perhaps most shocking was the revelation of just how vast Carlos's territory was. He didn't just control New Orleans, he had influence across 5 states, controlled gambling operations from Louisiana to Texas, had connections from the Gulf Coast to the Midwest. The trial made national news, shocked people in Louisiana who had either been unaware of Carlos's power or had chosen to ignore it. The little man wasn't just a mob boss, he was a shadow government, a criminal empire hidden in plain sight. Carlos Marcello entered federal prison in 1983, and for a man who had lived his entire life with absolute power and control, incarceration was devastating. He was stripped of everything: his authority, his freedom, his dignity. In prison, Carlos's health began to deteriorate rapidly. He suffered from dementia, his mind failing, his memories fading. The sharp, cunning criminal mastermind who had outmaneuvered law enforcement for decades was reduced to a confused old man who sometimes didn't know where he was. Some believed Carlos was faking the dementia to gain sympathy, to get released early. But medical evaluations confirmed it was real. His brain was failing, worn down by age, stress, and possibly Alzheimer's disease. Carlos served most of his sentence but was released early in 1989 due to his deteriorating health. He returned to Louisiana, to his home, but he was a shell of the man he had been. His empire was gone, seized by the government or taken over by others. His organization had collapsed without his leadership. He spent his final years under house arrest and medical supervision, barely aware of his surroundings, his mind lost in fog. The man who had terrified governors and controlled states was now helpless, dependent on family for basic care. On March 3, 1993, Carlos Marcello died at his home in Metairie, Louisiana. He was 83 years old. The official cause of death was complications from dementia and heart disease. His body and mind simply gave out. His death was noted in local and national news, but by that point, Carlos had been irrelevant for years. The empire he built had already collapsed, his power was long gone, and many younger people in New Orleans didn't even know who he was. Carlos's funeral was small, attended primarily by family. Many of his old associates were dead, in prison, or wanted nothing to do with the Marcello name. The FBI photographed everyone who attended, one final surveillance operation on a man who had evaded them for decades. Carlos was buried at Metairie Cemetery in New Orleans, in an Italian section where other mobsters and Italian-American community leaders were laid to rest. His grave marker is simple, listing his name and dates, nothing to indicate the empire he built or the fear he inspired. With Carlos's death, the New Orleans crime family effectively ceased to exist as a significant organization. There was no successor, no one capable of rebuilding what Carlos had created. The Southern mob empire died with its emperor. Carlos Marcello's true genius wasn't in violence or intimidation, it was in corruption. He understood that in Louisiana and the Deep South, everything was for sale. Politicians, judges, sheriffs, state officials, they all had a price. Carlos paid those prices systematically, building a network of corruption that extended from local police all the way to state government. Campaign contributions flowed to the right candidates, bribes went to the right officials, favors were exchanged, and Carlos's operations were protected. This corruption network was so extensive that Carlos operated almost openly for decades. His gambling operations ran in broad daylight, his loan sharking was common knowledge, his connections to organized crime were obvious. But law enforcement, either paid off or intimidated, did nothing. Louisiana governors during Carlos's reign were either on his payroll or afraid to cross him. Sheriffs across his territory protected his operations. Judges dismissed cases or handed down lenient sentences. The entire law enforcement and political apparatus in Louisiana was, to some degree, controlled or influenced by Carlos Marcello. This corruption was Carlos's most valuable asset and his most enduring legacy. Even after his death, Louisiana struggled with corruption problems that traced back to the culture Carlos had helped create. A culture where payoffs were normal, where political power was bought and sold, where the line between criminal and legitimate was deliberately blurred. Carlos Marcello's slot machine empire deserves its own chapter because it was the foundation of his wealth. At the peak of his power, Carlos controlled an estimated 2,000 to 3,000 slot machines across Louisiana and surrounding states. These machines were everywhere. In bars, restaurants, private clubs, gas stations, even some legitimate businesses. They generated consistent cash revenue, were relatively easy to service, and were enormously popular with working-class people who enjoyed the gambling. Carlos's organization had the slot machine business systematized. Technicians maintained the machines, collectors gathered the cash weekly, accountants tracked revenue, at least internally. It was a sophisticated operation disguised as entertainment. But the key to the slot machine empire was placement. Getting machines into establishments required either cooperation or coercion. Carlos used both, offering favorable terms to businesses that cooperated, using intimidation or violence against those who resisted. Law enforcement occasionally raided slot machine locations, seizing the machines and arresting operators. But the raids were theatrical, designed to show the public that something was being done. Behind the scenes, the machines would be returned or replaced, often with the same officials who had raided them receiving payoffs to look the other way. The slot machine empire generated millions of dollars annually for Carlos. Conservative estimates suggest at least $50 to $100 million over the decades he operated. It was reliable, sustainable, and perfectly suited to Louisiana culture. Churchill Farms, Carlos's vast swampland property, holds secrets that will likely never be fully revealed. Over the decades, numerous people disappeared in Louisiana, and many believe their bodies ended up in the bayous of Churchill Farms. The property was perfect for hiding evidence. The swamps, the remote location, the private ownership, bodies could be disposed of and would never be found. Alligators, natural decomposition, and the vastness of the wetlands ensured that whatever was buried there stayed buried. Federal agents believed that Churchill Farms was used for more than just meetings and legitimate farming. They suspected it was used for torture, for murder, for hiding victims. But proving it was impossible. The land was too vast, too wild, too dangerous to search comprehensively. When Carlos died and the property eventually changed hands, there were occasional discoveries, bones, items that suggested violence, evidence of things better left alone. But nothing was ever definitively proven, no major investigation ever bore fruit. Churchill Farms remains a symbol of Carlos's power and the mysteries that died with him. It's a place where the truth was buried in mud and water, where secrets rot in the bayou, where the little man's darkest deeds remain hidden forever. One of Carlos Marcello's most successful deceptions was his claim to be a legitimate businessman, specifically a tomato salesman and farmer. Throughout his life, Carlos maintained legitimate businesses that provided cover for his criminal empire. He owned farming operations, produced distribution companies, food service businesses. These weren't just fronts. They were real, functioning businesses that generated actual revenue. This gave Carlos legal income to explain his lifestyle and made him appear to be a legitimate member of the business community. Carlos would actually attend produce markets, conduct business transactions, maintain relationships with legitimate businessmen. He positioned himself as a successful Italian-American entrepreneur who had built wealth through hard work. This cover story persisted for decades. When questioned by law enforcement, Carlos would claim to be just a businessman, a farmer, someone being persecuted because of his Italian heritage. He played the role convincingly enough that some people actually believed it. But the tomato salesman story couldn't withstand serious scrutiny. When federal investigators examined Carlos's finances, they found that his legitimate businesses couldn't possibly generate the wealth he possessed. The produce operations were profitable but not that profitable. The Brilab trial destroyed the tomato salesman cover story completely. The recordings of Carlos discussing criminal operations, arranging bribes, wielding mob power, it exposed the lie. Carlos wasn't a tomato salesman. He was a mob boss who sold tomatoes on the side. Carlos Marcello's relationship with the Kennedy brothers defined much of his life in the 1960s. Robert Kennedy's aggressive prosecution of organized crime, his specific targeting of Carlos, and the deportation attempt created a hatred that consumed Carlos. Some of Carlos's associates later claimed that Carlos would rant about the Kennedys, would talk about wanting them dead, would discuss the possibility of assassination. These claims are disputed, unverified, possibly exaggerated by people seeking attention or deals with prosecutors. What's documented is that Carlos fought the Kennedys through legal means, challenging deportation orders, appealing convictions, using every legal tactic available. He also allegedly used his political connections to undermine Kennedy administration efforts in Louisiana. The deportation to Guatemala particularly enraged Carlos. Being literally kidnapped and dumped in a foreign country was humiliating, an insult to his power and dignity. He never forgot it, never forgave it. When President Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, Carlos was one of the first mob bosses suspected of involvement. His motive, his capability, his territory, including connections in Texas, everything pointed to him as a possible conspirator. But suspicion and proof are different things. Despite decades of investigation, no definitive evidence has emerged linking Carlos to Kennedy's assassination. The mystery remains, and Carlos took whatever truth he knew to his grave. Despite his small stature, Carlos Marcello had a legendary temper. Associates who worked with him described a man who could explode into rage, who would violently attack people who disrespected him, who demanded absolute obedience. Carlos once allegedly beat a man nearly to death with his own hands over a perceived insult. He was known to slap people, to physically intimidate despite his size, to use violence personally rather than always delegating it to others. This temper was both a strength and a weakness. It made people fear Carlos, made them understand that he was dangerous despite his small frame. But it also got him into trouble. The assault conviction in his youth came from a rage attack, and his temper sometimes led him to make impulsive decisions. As Carlos aged, he learned to control his temper better, to use violence more strategically. But those who knew him understood that beneath the businessman facade was a violent man capable of extreme brutality. Like many mob bosses, Carlos Marcello maintained mistresses and possibly had children outside his marriage. While these relationships were kept secret during his life, evidence emerged after his death suggesting Carlos had a complex personal life beyond his public marriage. Carlos's official wife, Jacqueline Tadero, stayed with him throughout his life, raising their children, maintaining the respectable family image. But Carlos reportedly had relationships with other women, kept apartments, supported shadow families. This wasn't unusual in mob culture. Wives were for respectability, mistresses for pleasure. The two worlds rarely intersected, and wives often knew but said nothing, maintaining the facade. When Carlos died, questions emerged about his estate, about who was entitled to what, about whether there were other heirs. The full extent of Carlos's personal life remains partially hidden, secrets buried with legal documents and sealed records. After Carlos's imprisonment, the New Orleans crime family entered a terminal decline. Without his leadership, his connections, his ability to maintain the corruption network, the organization fell apart. Some of Carlos's lieutenants tried to maintain operations, but they lacked his skills and relationships. The gambling operations were raided and shut down. The political connections dried up as officials who had been on Carlos's payroll retired or lost power. The territory that Carlos had controlled for decades was carved up by other families or simply abandoned. By the 1990s, the New Orleans crime family was essentially defunct. The FBI classified it as dormant, no longer a significant organized crime threat. Some individuals claimed connection to the family, engaged in small-time criminal activity, but there was no functioning organization. Carlos's sons didn't rebuild the empire. They had stayed largely out of the life, pursued legitimate careers, wanted nothing to do with their father's criminal legacy. This was Carlos's choice. He didn't want his children following his path, didn't want them suffering the consequences of organized crime. The empire that Carlos built, that dominated the South for 4 decades, that generated hundreds of millions of dollars, that corrupted entire state governments, collapsed in less than a decade after his removal. It was a complete organizational failure, proving that Carlos's operation was too dependent on his personal power to survive his absence. Carlos Marcello took numerous secrets to his grave. The full extent of his criminal operations, the identity of all his victims, his possible role in Kennedy's assassination, the location of bodies and evidence. These mysteries remain unsolved. His dementia in his final years meant that even if he had wanted to confess, to reveal secrets, he couldn't. His mind had failed before his body, and whatever knowledge he possessed died with his neurons. Historians, journalists, and law enforcement officials still investigate Carlos's life, searching for answers. FBI files, sealed court documents, interviews with aging associates. All of it provides pieces of the puzzle but never the complete picture. The Churchill Farms property continues to fascinate investigators. Occasional searches, occasional discoveries, but never enough to fully understand what happened there over the decades Carlos controlled it. Carlos Marcello remains one of the most enigmatic mob bosses in American history, powerful, successful, ruthless, yet ultimately unknowable. He left behind a legend but took the truth with him. Carlos Marcello proved that you didn't need to be in New York to be powerful, that a mob boss from the South could build an empire that rivaled anything in the Northeast. He demonstrated that corruption was more valuable than violence, that controlling politicians was more important than controlling streets. His life also demonstrated the ultimate futility of criminal empires. He built something massive, controlled states, generated fortunes, and it all disappeared within years of his removal. Nothing lasted, nothing survived, nothing remained except stories and mysteries. For the people of Louisiana, Carlos's legacy is complicated. He corrupted their government, damaged their state's reputation, made Louisiana synonymous with political corruption. But he also operated in a culture that allowed his rise, that enabled his operations, that profited from his corruption. The little man stood 5'4" but cast a shadow across the entire South. And when he fell, that shadow disappeared, leaving only questions about how one small man from Tunisia could own so much of America for so long. They measured him at 5'4". But Carlos Marcello was a giant who walked through Louisiana like he owned it, because he did. He bought governors, corrupted judges, buried bodies in the bayou, and possibly killed a president. They called him the Little Man. But there was nothing little about the empire he built, the fear he commanded, or the secrets he took to his grave. He owned the South for 40 years. And when he died with dementia in a hospital bed, confused and powerless, history lost the answers to mysteries that will haunt America forever.